The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
Over humanity!
The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every
Let us
city.
not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead.
They say that those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. This is the History Lessons Podcast with certified financial planning practitioner Patrick Huey, author of History Lessons for the Modern Investor, and your guide to financial wisdom in the past, present, and future. You ready? Good. Let's get historical.
Historical indeed. This is the History Lessons Podcast, and I'm Patrick Huey, author of History Lessons for the Modern Investor. And in this episode, we're talking football, fantasy football, with the all-knowing and all-powerful J.J. Zachariason. That's him on my shirt right there. Now, if you don't know J.J., he wrote an ebook called The Late Round Quarterback in 2012, and it literally changed his life. That lone document led him to a job at numberFire, where he helped build the site's content business from the ground up. numberFire was later bought by FanDuel in 2015, and he went on to spend years as that company's editor-in-chief. And there he developed one of the most popular podcasts in the fantasy football industry. He eventually left, and he went and started Late Round Fantasy Football in January of 2022. JJ's now talked to an audience of fantasy football diehards for more than a decade. He's met lifelong friends, won Fantasy Sports Writers Association awards, and he loves to tell people that he's worn gym shorts nearly every day of his 13-year career as a fantasy analyst. Now, when JJ's not shouting into his microphone about fantasy football, he's hanging out with his wife and 2 kids. Like me, he's a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, and he grew up in Western Pennsylvania. So Pittsburgh sports are never far from his mind. After some pretty heavy material about war and conflict these last few episodes, it's kind of nice to talk about something much more trivial and a heck of a lot more fun. So let's get started. Well, this is exciting for me because I've been following you, I think, since about 2021. I know it was during COVID that I first tuned in to a J.J. Zachariason podcast. By the way, thanks for tuning in, to steal a phrase. I remember very clearly enjoying the way you went about your process, the way you got to the heart of the matter pretty quickly, and I really enjoyed the show to begin with. And then I was probably about 4 or 5 episodes in. I think this is back when you were with FanDuel. But this is, I'm 4 or 5 episodes in, and you dropped a Pitt reference, and I went, wow. Now I have a man crush. So thanks for all the content over the years, and thanks for coming on the show.
Of course, man. Of course. Thank you for the kind words and for listening. I don't take it for granted when folks tell me that they're listening to my show or what have you, because it's what literally allows me to do this every day. So I really appreciate it.
Well, and it's such a cool journey. I mean, if you could take us through being a kid in Pittsburgh to now, working in gym shorts every day, as you say on the website, in fantasy football. I mean, it's crazy. Like, how do you explain to your parents what you do for a living?
Oh man. Well, fortunately my dad kind of grasped it well, because he's actually still in my home league with me, to this day. So he at least can fathom and grasp what's going on. My mom, not as much, but she's, supportive because she's a supportive mother. But yeah, I mean, I grew up in Pittsburgh, born and raised. I was born in McGee's Women's Hospital, which is right next to, it's on Pitt's campus, basically. Mm-hmm. So my dad used to always joke that I'm going to school 5 minutes from where I was actually born. But yeah, I grew up in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. And when you grow up in Pittsburgh, football is just kind of a part of you in a way. Yeah. The culture there, every stereotype that you see on television, whenever they, for every primetime game and stuff, they're always speaking about the city, talking about the city, and they're talking about how it's just ingrained in the culture. And it's all true. It's all completely true with Pittsburgh. Everywhere you go, like I grew up, growing up in Pittsburgh, you don't realize that other cities, like people aren't just walking around all the time in football jerseys and stuff, right? Whereas like that's what you did in Pittsburgh. And so football is always
funny story about that. And we'll obviously come back, but I had a friend who's not from the Berg, but was on a flight into Pittsburgh from, I don't know, Las Vegas or something. And he said, I was looking around and I saw all these Steeler jerseys. And so I asked, is there a game today? No, they're just wearing Steeler jerseys because they're from Pittsburgh.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, and look, there's Pittsburgh connections everywhere too. I remember I went to Seoul, South Korea for a 10-day trip with my wife and my buddy, because my one friend that I met at Pitt was teaching English over there. And so it was like it was right out of school. It was like a perfect opportunity to just be like, we're young. Let's just take this cool trip and let's do this. And we went over there, and I of course brought my terrible towel with me. And we're at this like gorgeous shrine in the middle of Seoul, South Korea. And we're getting a picture, and I have my terrible towel out, and someone walks up to me, and she's from Pittsburgh. Like literally like grew up in the town, or was living in the town that was the one north of where I grew up. But yeah, I mean, like it's just a part of sort of how you're raised, and you grow to love the team. I was fortunate that my dad actually, we split two season tickets for the Steelers around the time that Heinz Field opened. So for basically like my teenage life, I was able to go to a ton of Steeler games and stuff. And that also allowed me to just fall in love with the game. And then I just, from a fantasy football perspective, like fantasy football is a math numbers driven game. Anyone who says that it's just a football game is completely wrong. I mean, we're literally looking at numbers, and we're trying to accumulate numbers in a way to win in fantasy football. And I always had sort of that kind of like brain, and love statistics, and would, collect baseball cards mostly just to flip it around and look at player stats. Right. And so it was sort of this combination of love for the game of football, because I think where I was raised and sort of the environment that I was in, but then also this love for, numbers and competition too. I mean, you have to be somewhat competitive, to want to play this like silly game that we play. But it's just all of that combined just kind of got me into fantasy football at a pretty, I mean, the league that's going on right now that I'm still in, we started it in 2000, I think 2001 maybe. So it's been around for a while. Like I'm not that old. So it's like, I've been playing fantasy football since like 9th grade. So it's just always been a part of my life.
Yeah, similar. The league that I'm still in, I got into, I think 2003, and we'll talk about that a little bit, I think, later in this show. But what was the journey like getting started and realizing that, my God, man, I can do this for a living?
Yeah, it's funny. I graduated college, and I had like a background in graphic and web design that was self-taught. I did that in high school. While people were getting like typical high school jobs, I was building websites. This was back in like the early days of WordPress wasn't even really a thing at the time. And so I was building websites for small clients. But when you're in high school, if you get a $500 job for a website, which is cheaper for that client, but it's great for you as a high schooler, you're set for a really long time, for months on end for the summer. So I would build websites and stuff. And so I always knew that I would kind of leverage that and use that in my career someday. I thought at first I was going to go down the graphic design route. And so, I first started looking at some schools for that. But then I pivoted and I went and got my business degree in marketing. So I figured this is already self-taught. I already kind of understand how front-end development works and coding works, and also the graphic design side of things. Why don't I learn the business side and marketing a little bit better, and then kind of leverage that whenever I'm going to look for a job. So out of school, my now wife and I were dating in college, and she got a job out in Cincinnati. So I was looking for jobs in Cincinnati, and obviously Procter & Gamble's out there. So I got a gig at an ad agency. There's tons of ad agencies there because they're supporting Procter & Gamble. And so I got a job at an ad agency that was largely supporting P&G products. So at one point I was managing the Swiffer.com website. Like that was my job. And so but I got to a point.
Love our Swiffers around here, man.
That's right. But eventually, I mean, very quickly, I shouldn't even say eventually, it was just very, very quickly, probably a year in or so, I got to the point of like, I can't do this for the rest of my life. Like I realized that what I was doing as a project manager, it wasn't very fulfilling. I'm thinking to myself like, okay, I see the next 40 years and it is not this, right? And so one day when I was at work, I opened up a Word document and I just started kind of throwing my passions into this Word document, right? I was just putting stuff on there. Maybe I was going to pivot to doing development and coding, or maybe I was going to pivot and do more of the graphic design stuff, but I knew that what I was doing was not right. On that sheet of paper was fantasy football. I was just throwing stuff at at the wall, right? And I eventually started just kind of researching the fantasy football space a little bit, and I realized that the content that was out there was really, really reactive. It was really, and nothing against the folks who were doing content back in, this is in like 2011, right?
Yeah.
Nothing against the people who were doing content back then, the Matthew Berrys of the world and such, but it was very reactive to whatever was going on the previous season. Analysis was just reacting to what had happened then and not really being super forward thinking.
Right.
And I knew that I had a strategy, the late round quarterback strategy, that I had used for years and years and years in fantasy football. And it was all based on logic, sort of economic principles that I had learned in college, just very, logic and reasoning. And it was sort of reactive proof. It wasn't based on what happened the previous season. It was something that it was foolproof in a way. It was something that just worked every single year.
Yeah.
And so I decided to sort of combine my passion for fantasy football and my passion for design, if you will. And I created an ebook called The Late Round Quarterback. And at the time, ebooks were not like, oh, I can make this really cool stylized PDF and put it on any sort of distribution, Amazon, etc. I know it sounds crazy because it's only like 15 years ago, but at the time you had to there were programs where you had to actually code to be reactive on these different methods you would be reading the ebook on and stuff like that. And you had to really design it, in a different kind of way. And so I just kind of leveraged all of these different passion points of mine. And I created the Late Round Quarterback ebook. And then that went out in 2012, started to get some traction over that first year. And then I got a job a year in, which is a complete other story because it's kind of crazy, the connection with the first job that I got. But I got a job within a year. I did some work with I was writing on my blog every single day. I would not miss a day. Writing some posts on my blog, blasting it out to Twitter because that's where that's where the community was with fantasy football and sports media in general. And I would write these columns. I got noticed by NBC at one point, NBC Sports. I did some work for Roto World, which was a really, really big deal for me. And then I, from there, did a little bit of work. I wrote 3 articles for Pro Football Focus. And so it just kind of spiraled and snowballed. And then eventually that June, almost to the day, I got a full-time gig at numberFire.
Mm-hmm. And the rest, as they say, is history.
The rest, they say, is history. Yeah, I mean, the thing too, with the getting the full-time gig, there was definitely a connection that it was pretty wild. So numberFire at the time, it's now sunsetted, and they because FanDuel had bought it, and they officially shut it down last month, basically. But numberFire was founded by a guy named Nick Bonadio.
Mm-hmm.
And Nick actually graduated from the same high school as me 7 years prior. And he was actually friends with my brother back in the day. And Nick went on, this is when Regis Philbin came back to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Nick went on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. He won $100,000 on the show, and he used that as seed money for numberFire. So my job and career can sort of be credited to Regis Philbin in a way.
Which is great, except he's a Notre Dame grad.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
So a couple things that jump out at me, from the story. And the number one is really even going back to before you wrote Late Round Quarterback is the process, right? You've always been a process guy. And if you listen to his podcast, it certainly comes to the forefront. The process is key. But what I really like is, what you're saying about doing something different is you're eliminating hindsight bias, which to me is, the reason why a lot of your stuff resonates with me is I write about hindsight bias and confirmation bias and anchoring bias. as it relates to investing,
Mhm.
and you're looking at it as it relates to fantasy football, and it's amazing to me how often they cross over as I'm listening to your process. So, I mean, talk a little bit about how you got into really the mental piece of this, which is the way the human brain works, and it's not really set up to be successful at investing or fantasy football.
Yeah, it's a good question because I think that part of it is innate, like part of it just kind of came a little bit natural to me, but also it's reps and seeing sort of how things go down as you're participating in that activity, right? So like I'd played years of fantasy football at that time, similar to anyone who's investing, doing years and years of investing. You sort of just like learn things as you're going naturally, right? And so as I sort of went, like I'm super competitive, number one. So that's one thing that's important to know is that like I'm a competitive person. It's something that like I feel like you don't always want to admit that you're a competitive person. It's almost like a bad thing that you're ultra competitive. I'm not the person who's gonna like flip the Monopoly board if I lose or anything like that. But of course I want to win anything that I'm doing. And so one of the drivers for me with my work is often looking at the landscape and looking at what other analysts are doing and honestly wanting to be better. Like it's similar to the athlete mentality. It's similar to, the idea that, oh, I'm watching, I'm a quarterback in the NFL. I'm watching Patrick Mahomes just win year after year. That motivates me. I want to be that good. I want to be better than that. And so for me, a lot of it was looking at what mistakes other people were making in the space and realizing that a lot of the reason behind these mistakes that other analysts were making, and by mistakes, I'm just saying, I'm mostly saying like, oh, they're picking the same type of wrong player every year, or they're doing the same strategy every year, and it's just not working. I realized that came down to not necessarily the individual pick that they were making, but what went on before they made that pick, the process behind all of that, right? And so that's when I really started to realize, and this is fairly early on, I'd say, because, whenever I was writing the late round quarterback ebook, a large reason that ebook resonated and worked was because it was process oriented. And it all came down to me having to sort of deconstruct why I was doing what I was doing in these fantasy leagues. Why was I drafting quarterbacks late? Like that was the end result. I think a lot of people get to that point where they are doing some action, they're doing something, and it's coming, just naturally to them, right? But they're not really asking the why part, and they're not really analyzing why they got to that answer, why they got to that point. I have conversations with my wife all the time where I'm like, why are people doing X, Y, Z with marketing and with whatever like online product or their branding that they're doing for their influencer self? Why aren't they doing X, Y, and Z? And she's like, well, that comes naturally to you. It doesn't come naturally to other people, right? Mm-hmm. That's just the thing that I understand and am decent at, whereas I'm really, really bad at other things. And so it's sort of that like idea and mentality of like looking at what other folks are doing and not taking for granted what your individual knowledge and experiences are and deconstructing what those things are. And for me, it was, okay, I just naturally have gotten to this point of like, I know to draft a quarterback late, but why is it that I'm drafting these quarterbacks late? And then I started to dig into that more, and I'm asking these questions over and over again. Okay, why this, why this, why this? And I start to realize, oh, this kind of stems from some of the stuff that I learned in my economics courses at Pitt, or this kind of stems from, just this logic that I had talked about with a buddy, this time ago. And so to me, to answer that question from like where does the process come from, or the urge for wanting to understand the process is everything at the end of the day, right? Yeah. You can have, great results, but get lucky. You could throw a dart at a random stock and sure, that hits and you 10x in a day, what have you. But at the end of the day, if you don't know how you got to that point, it's not repeatable. It's not something that you can do each, year, like day over day, year over year. Yep. And so with fantasy football, it's the exact same thing. I'm looking at other analysts and I'm like, okay, you're doing the same, bad result thing, but even if it's a good result, you're doing the same thing over and over again. And it's just a roller coaster. There's no rhyme or reason for the result happening the way that it's happening. Let's deconstruct that and figure out why.
And that I was actually listening to a couple of your podcasts yesterday in the gym that are the season enders. What I got right and what I got wrong. And to me, that took me back, to where I got my process from, which was the military.
Mm.
And when we were flying jets, the mantra was brief, fly, debrief, right? You brief what you're going to do, you go out and execute, you come back and you talk about what you did well and what you did not so
Yeah.
well. And that's the only way you're going to improve over time. So I've taken that with me into my career in investing. And what you're doing on the fantasy football side is exactly the same, right? And I think it's an important piece that, in any endeavor, you only get better by going in and looking at what you did well and doing more of that, and what you did poorly and doing less of it.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know, the results are pretty good, right, JJ? I mean,
yeah.
You're probably in like 27 different leagues, so it's probably hard to manage.
That's the thing though, is that like a lot of folks are like, well, how do you know if the results are something that you should be changing? Like how do you know? And I think that that's a more difficult question to answer. Like I don't really, it depends on what field you're looking at and stuff, but like at the end of the day, you also just kind of know, like, you use the gym example, right? If I'm going out and I'm trying to train for a half marathon, right? And my mile time from January to March has not improved whatsoever, then you know that you should be looking at how you're training and what's going on. Maybe it's a diet thing. Maybe it's whatever that thing is, right? You got to at least change something up. Otherwise, it's the definition of insanity, right? That's
Right.
what everyone talks about. And so I think that you just kind of naturally, from a results standpoint, you see where there might need to be change, then you kind of enact change. But I also think that there should always be change. Like I'm very, very pro, like that's why I do those episodes that you were referencing where I talk about the things I got wrong. I talk about the things I got right, because I think it's a natural human inclination to look back at something that went your way and say, I did that because I was smart. I did that because I got it right and I'm a smart human being. And of course, that's just the way that it should go. And then we always are so focused on whenever things go bad or go wrong, we're naturally going to find reasons as to why that went wrong. But when things go right, we don't find reasons. We're just like, yeah, that went right. That's the way that it should have gone, right? Yeah. But you don't deconstruct that when that's just as important as the stuff that goes wrong. So if you're constantly evolving and you're constantly changing and looking at that process that led to both the favorable and unfavorable results, you're just going to naturally see better and better results as you move forward.
Yep. I think it's the thinking man or thinking person's way to approach fantasy football. I think it's also the thinking person's way to approach investing. And I think it's the thinking person's way to approach life. If you really want to get better, if you really want to keep improving, you have to have a trackable process, and you have to have, that data and analysis, and then go back and rework your assumptions when things don't work out.
Yeah, 100%. And I see folks, in my space often where, they've been doing, so, the fantasy football space is more competitive than people probably realize in terms of trying to do this for a living or like be an analyst in the space. There's a lot of people that would love to do that, obviously. And there's a lot of people that, are grinding during the day and they have families and they're getting their work done. Then they're coming home and they're taking care of their families. And then at night, they're writing articles and they're analyzing the game and stuff like that. And a lot of them, I've seen it like through the last 15 years, a lot of them will go to Twitter, social media, and they will often hit a point where they're like, why am I doing this? Nothing is coming from this. And I just want to look at them and say, you're just doing the wrong thing right now. It's not that you're incapable. It's just that you're not touching the people that you need to touch in terms of reaching the right audience and stuff like that. You got to probably change something up to then resonate with whatever audience you're trying to reach. Well, and it's
hard because of those biases we talked about, right? Like the
100%
brain is just a bias machine. The brain likes to take shortcuts. It likes to get to a decision without all the data. That's just the way we've evolved. And you got a 10,000-year-old brain. and you've got technology that was, introduced yesterday. And it's
Yeah.
a very difficult thing for people to get by. I mean, they just want to keep doing the same things. Again, because of that confirmation bias.
Yeah, it's comfortable.
And yeah, it's comfortable. Exactly. And I have those. I obviously have these conversations with people in different endeavors, but yeah, it's the same brain, right?
Yeah,
and same mistakes.
Yep.
So, can we talk a little bit about the season?
Sure.
I thought it was a very interesting fantasy football season. I'm in a 14-team league. It's a disaster. I've never won it. It's all kinds of funky rules, including individual defenders, and it's just a crazy, crazy league. And this was a year where if you were at the back of the draft, you were kind of screwed.
Yeah.
Because there was not a whole lot going on the waiver wire. There were no Puka Nakuas this year. There were no Devontae Achans. It was just a desert when it came to the waiver wire. Do you see that as well? I mean, you work with this day in, day out. I get most of my information from you.
Yeah. I think it was a different year for sure. A big driver of that was the lack of running back injuries.
Yeah.
And because if you think about it, on the waiver wire in fantasy football, the bigger ticket item or players are usually going to be running backs more than wide receivers, because I always say this whenever I talk about this stuff, and I always preach this, but wide receiver is a more talent driven position than running back is. It's not to say that running backs can't be talented. Obviously, Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, they're very talented players. But at the end of the day, from a fantasy perspective, again, we're trying to accumulate numbers. And if a coach sits there and says, hey, Saquon, we're going to split this backfield, you and Kenneth Gainwell are going to see a 50-50 split, then there's nothing you can do. Like Saquon Barkley can be the most talented player in the world, but if he's only seeing half of the team's backfield touches, that doesn't matter at the end of the day. Whereas at wide receiver, you're going to have 3 or 4 guys in the field at one time. And so talent is going to win out, because at wide receiver, you got to get open in order to see a target. You got to get open in order to accumulate yards. Now, obviously, there's going to be schemes and play calls that favor certain wide receivers in certain environments. But at the end of the day, wide receiver is a much more talent-driven position than running back is. And so with the waiver wire, think about what the waiver wire is. It's players who were rejected during your draft, right? These are like lower-tiered guys that people didn't want in August when we were drafting. And so naturally, that means that there's going to be less talent out there. And if talent drives wide receiver more than it does running back, then that means it's going to be a little bit more difficult to find a plug-and-play wide receiver just randomly off the waiver wire, because that would be a big talent misevaluation by a large number of people. Right. You're going to find that happening. It usually happens with younger guys who people just don't know how good they are yet, right? Yep. Like Puka Nacua, for instance. Yep. And so, those guys will slip through the cracks, and those are going to be the big waiver wire winners. But it's usually a lot easier to find a plug-and-play player, at running back, because if a running back gets hurt, Jonathan Taylor goes down, you at least know that one of the 2 backs in that backfield will get some work. Even if they're not going to be as good as Jonathan Taylor, they'll still get some work and maybe be usable to some degree, right? This episode of the History Lessons podcast is sponsored by Victory Independent Planning. Hey, are you ready to take the stress out of your retirement? At Victory Independent Planning, we put you on the right trajectory with our exclusive VIP retirement glide path. Our smart approach prepares you for what's next by optimizing your sources of savings and income, your medical and healthcare planning, your advanced estate and giving strategies, risk management and investing, and tax planning. Let us help you glide into retirement with confidence. Text GlidePath to 239-567-5477. That's GlidePath, all one word, small letter G, to 239-567-5477, and receive a link to schedule a complimentary consultation. Do it today to start your journey on the VIP retirement glide path, because your future deserves a safe landing. Right. And so this year, and I did the analysis on it, this year, when you look at the top running backs across the league, they missed fewer games than any season that we've seen over the last decade plus. And so what that means is, with fewer running back injuries, those running backs not only are going to perform a little bit better, because they're not getting hurt. But the waiver wire is going to be a little bit thinner because there's not going to be a running back that steps in for that player, with an injury. So at wide receiver, there were a decent amount of injuries this year amongst the top players. But the difference is that when a wide receiver gets hurt, a player stepping in at wide receiver still has to have that talent associated with him in order to be a really valuable player in both football and in fantasy football. Running back is just a little bit different. Like we saw, look at the Chiefs right now. They've been using Kareem Hunt all year, who no team wanted at all. And he's been fine for them. He hasn't been like amazing, but he's been fine, right? That's just the way that the running back position works. So that to me is the main reason that this season was way, way different than most of the seasons that we've seen in recent history.
And I think you hit on something important there too, not again for fantasy football and investors, which is, you don't control usage. You don't control what the coaches are going to eventually decide on schemes and game plans. So there are things that you don't control. Yeah. And you have to be okay with that. That has to be part of your process and part of your mental debrief, which is, I did this correctly. I followed my process. I followed my plan. But at the end of the day, it just didn't pan out. And I think that process of continuing to reevaluate is very important.
I say it all the time on my show, and people make fun of me for it at times too, but I always tell people to embrace variance, right? That's what you need to do. I think in many facets of life, but with this especially, and with investing too, it's the idea that you're not controlling everything. This is not a situation where, you are going to the gym and you are just yourself and you can train and do X, Y, and Z better with your diet and with your nutrition, but also with the way that you're lifting or the way that you're running. And you can get better individually, and you're the one that's controlling that for them. Now, obviously, some things are going to pop in. Maybe you have an ailment or whatever, but you can control a lot more in that environment than you can control in a football predicting environment, right? In a forecasting environment. Same deal with investing, where you can look at what your data is saying and you can make a rational choice. And I always say that if you make a rational choice and a rational decision, you've already won, even if you end up losing, because that's the most important part, is that you're being rational at the time of the decision, as opposed to looking at what happened at the end of the day. And so same thing happens with football all the time. I really like Jalen Waddle this year, right? For Miami, and he had a horrible season. And part of that was the Tua injury, right? His quarterback going down. Part of it was just something completely unforeseen that they decided to use a tight end that they had signed, who I did like too, Jonnu Smith. But Jonnu Smith and Devon Achane started getting a lot more work as receivers themselves when no one saw that coming, and that's just going to happen sometimes, and so you just gotta have to embrace that fact.
Yeah, I love the idea of embracing variance. I mean, my dad used to say variety is the spice of life, but that same variety when you're looking for an outcome, be it a league championship, knock on wood, or an early retirement, it can be frustrating. It can be really frustrating. And I know I've been frustrated with fantasy football, and I turn on the TV on Sunday and I'm watching the Red Zone channel and none of my players are popping up. It's not a fun feeling. But we're going to fix that when I join your Patreon.
Heck yeah. And the other thing too, I think as you do things more and more, right? Like as you whether you're using a financial advisor or whether you're doing it yourself or what have you, as you do things more and more and you get more reps, you start to feel more confident in those ups and downs, and you start to not really like feel the ups and downs nearly as much.
And the advice piece too, like I enjoy your show because it makes me feel better to know that the guy who does this for a living does the same stupid stuff I do from time to time. Right. So, and I appreciate that. I appreciate getting advice from a real person.
100 for
it
sure.
helps you, right? It helps you avoid the biases, and it helps you recognize when your process is broken. So I think that's a cool part of it too. Yeah.
I think though that it's one of those things where I'm sure you've hit on crazy stocks in the past where you're like this is amazing, where you're borderline shocked that it went the way that it did, right? Favorably for you, right? And if you do that,
and the other
right. But if you do the favorable things often, and a little bit more often than not, right?
Yeah.
And I think that like with what I've realized, especially over the last like couple years, because now I'm out on my own and there's a little bit more on the line for me in terms of what I'm producing and what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And, like I can look back, I do prospect guides every year where I'm looking at running backs and wide receivers that are going from college to the pros, and I'm doing write-ups on them and I'm putting rankings together. And that's all based on a model that I created, a handful of years ago. And, like last year's prospect guide probably wasn't as good as the year before that and the year before that, the first 2 prospect guides I did, right? But I'm okay with it because, obviously I want to be perfect all the time. I'm human. I want to be right. I'm putting myself out there. Of course, you want to be right a lot more than you're wrong, but it's comforting knowing that that process has delivered really good results in the past. And so once you get to that point where you have years and years of evidence, you then start to feel a lot better about that variance roller coaster. You're like, yeah, I screwed up and this is why I screwed up and it's okay. And it's a lot more difficult to manage that early on in your experience with that thing. So like if you just start fantasy football today and this was this season and this was your first year and it was just this constant up and down, you'll get used to that and you realize, oh, this is where, back then where it went right and this is where it went wrong. And that's what's to be expected. Whereas if you don't have that experience, it's just a lot more difficult.
I think that's a good point. I'm thinking back to, when I got started in this business coming out of the military and working in the financial district down in San Francisco. And people would ask me my opinion on stuff. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I have no experience, but I'll fake it till I make it.
Right.
And, trying to go through a retirement plan with somebody in those days was difficult for me because I didn't have the confidence of knowing that the process works. 20 years later, I know the process works. So it's a lot easier to have those type of conversations.
Yeah. And it's really easy too, to, as you get more, and I'm actually writing about this in this year's prospect guide to open up the guide. It's a little, I always like to just throw stories out there and stuff like that because it's just important to connect with the reader that way. But the one that I read, or the one that I wrote about, is this experiment that happened in 1951. Everyone probably knows about this by now, but it's about conforming and conformity.
Yeah.
And the line experiment, right? So this psychologist got 8 men together, and he would have different groups of 8, and he would put them in a room. And he'd have 2 cards. One card had a line on it. The other card had 3 lines on it. And the 3-line card was labeled A, B, and C. The card with 1 line matched identically to one of the 3 lines on the other card. And he would go one by one down a row of the same guys, and they would go in the same order every time. And the first couple rounds, it was a very obvious answer which line matched up with the line on the one card. And so he'd go one by one. And the first couple rounds that they did this, the first 7 participants who were actors in the experiment would get the right answer, and they would say the right answer. And then the 8th person, who was not the actor, would also get the right answer. Yep. But then as they go on, the actors are purposely getting the answer incorrectly, right? And what they found is that the person who was going last, who was not the actor, who was basically the person that they were experimenting on at the end of the day, that person missed or got the answer incorrectly 37% of the time, right? Yep. They were just conforming to what everyone else was saying. And that's, to me, conformity comes down to a lack of confidence at the end of the day, right? And so for me, with my prospect model and the stuff that I was doing, when I first started, I was not confident in what I was pushing out there. And so I would read other takes and see what other people were saying, and I would sort of just conform, and I would morph their takes into mine, and it would become a groupthink thing, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas now, I'm to the point where, like, I'm confident in what has been built because I've tested this. I have years of experience using it and doing it. And now I can be confident and not conform as much. And by the way, they did that exact same experiment with no actors, and they only got 0.7% of the answers incorrectly versus 37% whenever they had the folks conforming. It's just that's the way that human brains think. And it's a really, really big deal with the stuff that we do, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, groupthink is another one that I talk about in my book as well, because, again, we're always looking for shortcuts, whether we know it or not. And I think the instant that you take that step and realize that your brain is flawed and that you don't make decisions well without a good process, that's the first step. And again, I think that's why your stuff has always resonated with me, is because you talk about the same things that I talk about, like that groupthink mentality. But yeah, I love that, confidence can break you out of a groupthink scenario. It can also lead to the opposite if you're not careful. If you don't understand that your brain is flawed and just assume that, everything that you hear is correct and everything that you say is correct.
It can go south quick.
That can be problematic for sure. So what does a day in the life of JJ Zachariason look like, off season and on season?
Oh man, it's pretty boring. From an outsider.
Two kids. I don't buy that for a second.
No. I love it. It's to me, I live the dream. But it's it's a very standard day. I have two kids, 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. And so right before we hopped on here, I was dropping my kid off at school and all that. I have a great wife who we'll celebrate our 10-year anniversary married in June. But we've been together for like 18 years at this point. So we've known each other for basically, I mean, we've known each other since high school. So more than half of our lives at this point.
Oh, wow.
And so, live in the suburbs in Charlotte. So day in the life, I wake up in the morning, do the dad things, gotta make sure that, they're number one and that they're feeling good going off to school and such and daycare. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it in season, there's a pretty strict schedule for me where, there's the same content that I'm producing every week, from a podcasting standpoint. But now that, a few years ago, so numberFire that I talked about earlier, numberFire was eventually bought by FanDuel in 2015. And then after I was there as the editor-in-chief for a number of years, I decided in 2022, actually, tomorrow is the anniversary of the start of the late round fantasy football brand. But 3 years ago, I started late round fantasy football to be able to have the freedom to create what I wanted to create. And, I already sort of had an audience that I had built with the podcast and such. So part of my day now is sort of doing maintenance on the business and making sure that everything's looking good from a numbers perspective and financially looking all right, and that sales are going the way that I want them to go and I forecasted them to go.
Well, I took a look at the merch this morning. That's looking good.
Yeah. There's some merch
I'll
out
have
there.
to get myself a t-shirt.
There you go. Yeah. So, there's some merch out there that I just kind of threw out there. I did test the t-shirts and the quality of the hoodies like relentlessly because I'm very, very
That's
like
smart.
It's important to me. Yeah, it's very important to me. But yeah, I have a very strict schedule in season where I every day am doing preparing for a different podcast that gets released in the morning the next day. One of the most important things that I've found with content creation is just the consistency of it and being there for your listeners. So, you said that you listen to the Late Round podcast. Like, one of the most important things for me is to make sure that that every Tuesday morning you will get the 15 transactions episode, that every Wednesday morning you'll get the 10 trends episode, that every Thursday morning you get the sleepers episode. And so, that's where my in-season stuff and work really goes into, is just making sure that all of this content that I'm doing on this weekly schedule, because the NFL is a weekly game, making sure that it's all out there consistently good to go. Whether I'm sick, whether I'm not sick, it doesn't matter. It's got to get out. And then the off season, which is where I'm at now, I know, a lot of people think they're like, oh, the Super Bowl hasn't happened yet, so your season's not. My season ends towards the end of December, really, because that's when the fantasy football season typically ends. And so once January hits, I start to go into prospect mode a little bit. I'm tweaking my models. I'm thinking about and I'm ideating different shows that I can do. One of the big things for me in the fantasy football content space is that if you look across the industry, a lot of people are doing the standard like team previews or, just a very, very like high level, not very conceptual types of content. And some of that stuff can be good, but when there's a lot of it, it just kind of gets lost in the shuffle. So what I try to do with my ideation is really think about things that I'm interested in, number one, and questions that I'm asking, but things that just aren't really out there in the space. So, for instance, at the end of the season, I did a podcast on the running back renaissance, talking about how, what we said earlier about how running backs were a little bit different this year, and were they like, did data actually support that? And data did support it, but I was able to do a show on that and talk about what that means moving forward, and really dig into like the fun research oriented studies during the offseason. Then in the offseason, I'm also creating these guides. So I do a prospect guide that goes out in March. And then in May, again, I update it when the NFL draft happens. And then right after that, I start working on the draft guide, which is for your season-long drafts. If you're in an office league, if you're in a friends league, what have you, that guide is for that specifically, where I'm giving you a bunch of research that I've done through the years. And I'm then at the end of it giving you some players to target, players to avoid, and such. So, it's a different vibe. In season, it's more militaristic, if you will. It's just very regimented and very much like on
impressively so.
Yeah. And whereas in the off season, it's more flowy, and it's nice to have that sort of dichotomy and dynamic, because I can give my brain a rest and use a different side of my brain, in different parts of the year. In season, I'm very much just like, get this done. Let's update the spreadsheets, just do this thing over and over and over again. And it's kind of like a psychological thing that you got to deal with too, because you're doing it gets mundane when like Thanksgiving hits. We have a bunch of fantasy analysts that I'm friends with. We always talk about that, like Thanksgiving is the time of year where not only do we need a little bit of a break, but it's always the time of year. And I'm not complaining. I have the best job in the world, but it's always the time of year where you're like, okay, I gotta strap in. This is really, really starting to get difficult, because I'm doing the same thing over and over again. Yeah. And then once you kind of get over that hump and you're done with December, that's when you can relax a little bit and start doing that more high level thinking stuff.
You mentioned the running back renaissance, and it made me think of another concept that you talk about a lot that is applicable to investing, and that's reversion to the mean. So do you feel like that running back revolution this year will revert, because the lack of injuries may not be sustainable?
Yeah. To me, I've written about this in my draft guides before too, but to me,
don't give away any content.
No, it's fine. In the draft guide, I'm very like mindful about differentiation with my content, right? I do it with a purpose, of course. You can't just differentiate and be different just to be different and just to throw whatever out there. Right. But I do want to at least bring something a little bit different to the table than what you're going to get in a typical like draft guide, for instance. A typical draft guide that a company is going to produce is just going to have a bunch of player profiles, and it'll say, here's the breakdown of how good or bad this player is, and then here's whether or not you should draft him or not, which is fine. If you're good at it, you're good at it. That's fine. I'm not trying to say anything negative about people who produce that kind of content. But with my draft guide, I get a little bit more philosophical. And I talk about the psychology side of fantasy football a little bit. And I do a lot of work on average draft position, which to me is what the market is saying, right? And how the market dynamics really work. Because I think it's important. But one of the things, to your point about regression, I have a chapter in that draft guide every year. And one of the years I just called it regression is everything, right? To me, regression is the number one thing that anyone playing fantasy football, probably investing to, should at least comprehend and understand that just because something's going up does not mean that it's going to just continue to go up over and over again. And there's a lot of people who, fall victim to the gambler's fallacy, though, as well, where they see, someone doing something really, really good, and they therefore think, oh, regression means that player is now, or that thing is going to now be very, very bad. But it's not that. It's just that they're going to regress. And the examples I always, for some reason, I always go to golf and bowling. Okay. But with golf is a really easy example for me. Let's say that you're I shoot around 90, right? Like I'm like a 90 golfer. I'm very average, incredibly average golfer. And I always blame my dad, because he got my brother golfing instruction lessons, but he never got me any lessons. And then I was a baseball player, so I have this
baseball
terrific
swing,
baseball swing. Yeah. Anyway, so you're playing golf, and I'm used to shooting 90, 92, right? So I go out and I play, and one round I shoot an 83. And I'm like, wow, this was pretty incredible. But I did nothing to get better during that period to shoot that 83. So
Right.
the next time I go golfing, should I expect myself to shoot an 83? Probably not. I'm probably going to revert back to the mean. But that mean does not mean that I'm going to take that 83 number and now shoot a 100 and average that out to get closer to where my typical score is. All
Right.
it means is that I'm going to shoot closer to that 90, 92 that I typically shoot, right? And I think a lot of people get that wrong too with the gambler's fallacy, which would say the gambler's fallacy would say, if you're flipping a coin and you're trying to predict if it's going to be heads or tails, you get 3 tails in a row, you say to yourself, oh, this is definitely going to be heads because I got 3 tails in a row. No, it's still a 50-50 proposition
50-50.
at the end of the day.
I literally have that exact verbiage in the book that's up on the screen right now. And it's in history lessons about the gambler's fallacy.
And it's really, really important because you start to think in really incorrect ways when you do fall victim to the gambler's fallacy. And that's how it is with fantasy football and football in general. If a player has this massive, like let's say that he scores a lot of fantasy points one day, but he had 2 big plays. You can't expect those big plays to just repeat over and over again. You gotta understand that he's going to regress back to what he typically does.
Because we're both from Western Pennsylvania, what's the bowling analogy?
It's basically the exact same. Yeah. I should throw some Jerome Bettis perfect games in there and talk about that as the analogy. But no, it's the exact same thing. If you're typically a 150 bowler and you bowl a 200, you can't just assume that that's what you're going to be doing moving forward.
Yeah, I've also heard you talk on the show about the endowment effect, which is a big one with investing as well, where you will hold on to a player because he's yours. And you can't imagine, putting him out there on the market in trade, because you can't imagine getting the value back that, you value that player higher probably than the market does because he's yours.
Yes. It frustratingly is probably the biggest reason. No, not probably. It is the biggest reason that, because in fantasy football, you can trade, you can send players from one team.
Our
to the
league
other.
is a great example of 14 teams. I think we had 2 trades this season.
Right. And the reason for that is the endowment effect, as you're saying, that people value what they have a lot more than what they would be receiving in a situation like that.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's no getting around that from a fantasy football perspective because you're playing with other humans and humans are naturally just going to fall victim to that.
Yeah.
But what I always say, from like a trading, like if we use trading as an example, what I always say is you have to look at, this is no different than sales. Like you got to look at what that person needs first and foremost and approach it from that perspective, as opposed to saying like, oh, I have this player that I really want to get rid of and I'm going to force that player onto you.
Yeah.
You're not going to get a trade done that way because people might not need that player.
You mentioned obviously being a sports fan growing up. Since I've gotten back into fantasy football over the last few years, what I've noticed, and I we can edit this out later, JJ, if you're uncomfortable with where this goes, but have you noticed being less of a Steelers fan because you're more involved with fantasy football?
100%. Yeah. No editing needs to be happening. I've said this plenty of times before. A lot of it is the objectivity that I have to approach the game with.
Yeah.
But with that comes an appreciation for what other franchises do. Right. So like you tell me when I was 19 that I would actually want the Ravens to win a game or, to win a playoff game or something. And that I would like the Ravens quarterback and their head coach and what they're like. My 19-year-old self would say, you're absolutely nuts. Right. But I just appreciate what they're doing. And at the same time, I don't appreciate some of the stuff that the Steelers do. I think that there's a lot of really objectively stupid things that they're doing year in and year out. And so, yeah, I mean, like you just naturally, to me, it's more about appreciation. And yeah, I always tell people, like, I don't know if it's a maturation thing and me just getting older, that I don't really like let a Steelers loss get to me, or if it is that objective nature to how I'm approaching things with football. But I just don't really get that upset if the Steelers lose. I celebrate the wins. I don't know if that makes me a bandwagon fan at this point, but The fact that I have the history that I have with the Steelers, you can't call me a bandwagon fan.
No, not at all. But I also think being a Pitt fan, you're used to having to take tough losses.
I'll tell you what, man. I was at Pitt when the basketball team was awesome.
Yeah.
But when they lost to
years.
Yeah, when they lost to Villanova, I was at Pitt at that time. There was no, I mean, it was so much fun.
Yeah.
You know, Dwan Blair and Sam Young and Levance Fields, so much fun. But it does teach you a lesson whenever you just consistently are losing year after year in the most heartbreaking fashion imaginable.
Yep, they'll figure out a way, and they did it again this year, opening up 6-0, and I said, don't buy in, don't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, I was right.
Yep.
All right. So one thing on your website that I pulled up was one of your specialties is bad dad jokes. Go.
Oh man. So my father-in-law and I are always sending, because we just randomly will send jokes back and forth. I wonder if he had one. He sent one yesterday that was pretty good. But no, I mean, like, it's just the dumb stuff to embarrass your kids.
Yeah.
that kind of work.
Well, I tell my son I collect these jokes and I put them in a file.
Yeah, right.
It's called my dad base.
There you go. Perfect.
And if I can get him to cringe, my day is made.
Yes. Yes.
Well, cool. Hey, thanks for the conversation today. Let people know where they can get a hold of you, find your stuff. I mean, I mentioned Patreon, definitely the Late Round website. Where do they go?
Yeah, lateround.com has everything. It's sort of just a hub. There's no editorial on there. That was an active choice that I made. I don't want to play that game anymore.
Yeah.
So you can pivot to the Patreon. I have my guides on there if you're interested in that. And then you can subscribe to the newsletter.
Send you 13 names to blacklist from that Patreon.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, and then I'm on Twitter. That's my main source of getting in Blue Sky and stuff now. But it's just at Late Round QB.
Well, thanks again, because we've had a couple of really heavy episodes about war and conflict. Kind of nice to dial it back and talk about fantasy football for an hour.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks. So what lessons can investors take away from fantasy football? Well, there are quite a few that we talked about during the show. But really, it all boils down to this. Think about what you think about. Think about what you think about. Because what you are aware of, you can direct, you can change, you can improve. But what you're oblivious to, well, that's going to direct you. It's going to lead you down a certain path. What we're talking about here is your mental ability to understand how your brain works and doesn't work. You must have a process for dealing with the massive amounts of information that get thrown at you on a daily basis, either in fantasy football or as an investor. To say that your brain is not adequately wired for this is the understatement of the century. How could it be? Evolutionarily, we have had access to this amount of information for like a second or two. But the first step to overcoming your innate biases and mental shortcuts is to know that they exist. So I'm thankful to JJ for continuing to point them out in the world of fantasy football. We listed several, and just in this episode, like endowment effect and anchoring bias, confirmation bias, and the gambler's fallacy. And there are more if you listen to JJ's podcast or you read my book, History Lessons for the Modern Investor. By the way, that's available on Amazon.com. But I'll tell you what, I'll send you one free if you write to me and you mention this particular show. As noted during the interview, what I like about JJ is his process. You should copy it. Plan, do, and review. Or as we used to say when flying jets, plan the flight, fly the flight, debrief the flight. Rinse, repeat, and adjust as necessary. Be honest with yourself. Be honest about your wins and your losses, your brilliant inspirations, and your palm to forehead moments. For investors, this is no game. So you have to take it at least as seriously and make sure you're putting in as much effort as you do your fantasy football lineup. If not, and here is a big lesson I learned this football season, is that it's time to go find help. If you can't do it on your own, if you can't crunch the numbers, if you can't avoid your mental biases getting in the way, it's okay to go find help. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why I signed up for JJ's Patreon, because I needed the help. Well, my fellow historians, that is all for this episode. Be sure to check out JJ's work, including the Late Round podcast. Also, go check out lateround.com. That's where you're going to find all the merch like this shirt, as well as research, draft guides, all that again at lateround.com. While you're surfing the web, check me out on Amazon. That's where the book is, History Lessons for the Modern Investor. Or just text book to 239-567-5477, and I'll send you a copy. And be sure to do all the social stuff. Like this episode, follow us wherever you see or you hear podcasts. We're available on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Until next time, we'll take another rollicking romp through the past, or the gridiron, and make an investment in your future with history lessons for the modern investor. Goodbye, everybody.